September 11, 2001 began as a normal workday in New York and Washington. 19 Al-Qaeda terrorists would change that. They boarded 4 separate planes that morning, intent on causing mass death and destruction. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11, a Boeing 767, crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. 17 minutes later, at 9:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175, another Boeing 767, struck the South Tower. Fire spread through multiple floors while emergency crews moved into the buildings and surrounding streets. At 9:37 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77, a Boeing 757, crashed into the Pentagon. At 9:59 a.m., the South Tower collapsed. Just 4 minutes later, at 10:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 93, the last of the hijacked planes, would crash in a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Passengers on United 93 had learned from loved ones that other hijacked planes had struck targets and decided to fight back. Their attempt to retake the cockpit forced the hijackers to crash the plane and prevented it from reaching its intended target. Finally, at 10:28 a.m., the North Tower collapsed. Debris and ash covered lower Manhattan as first responders searched for survivors and evacuated nearby buildings. Transportation systems shut down, airspace was closed, and federal sites increased security. Nearby hospitals prepared for mass casualties, while families tried to locate relatives who worked in or near the towers, the Pentagon, or were traveling. Nearly 3,000 people were killed across the 3 crash sites, with thousands more injured. In the days that followed, missing persons posters appeared all over the city. The recovery at Ground Zero continued for months as crews removed debris, identified victims, and stabilized nearby structures. After the attacks, U.S. airspace was closed and aviation rules were rewritten. Airport screening moved under the newly created Transportation Security Administration, or TSA. Cockpit doors were reinforced, air marshals and watch lists were expanded. The federal government reorganized, creating the Department of Homeland Security and later a Director of National Intelligence to improve information sharing. Congress passed new counterterrorism laws, and the U.S. launched military operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. Cities overhauled their emergency communications and high-rise procedures, and long-term health programs were set up for responders and survivors exposed to dust and smoke. Memorial sites were established in New York, at the Pentagon in Arlington, and near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. On the day after Christmas in 2004, a massive undersea earthquake struck off the coast of Sumatra, about magnitude 9.1. The rupture lifted the seafloor and displaced a huge volume of water. A tsunami radiated across the Indian Ocean. Along the coast, the sea pulled back. Minutes later, high, fast waves came ashore and swept inland. Neighborhoods near low beaches were overrun. Reinforced buildings failed under the impact of the debris. Airports, ports, and roads were damaged or submerged. Power and communications went down. Search and rescue began with local police, soldiers, and civilians using trucks, boats, and whatever tools they had. Hours later, waves reached Sri Lanka and India. Trains, roads, and towns near the coast were hit. Thailand's resort areas saw heavy casualties among residents and tourists. The Maldives reported flooding across multiple islands. The death toll climbed quickly as officials accounted for missing persons and identified the dead. Hospitals operated beyond capacity. Temporary morgues and missing persons lists were established at airports and stadiums. Within days, international teams arrived by air and sea. Naval vessels brought water, food, and medical staff. Field hospitals and shelters went up near damaged homes. Aid groups coordinated evacuations from isolated areas. Damage surveys mapped entire coastal stretches where houses, seawalls, and fishing fleets were destroyed. In many locations, only concrete slabs or foundations remained. Fatalities totaled about 230,000 across 14 countries. Millions were displaced or lost their income as fishing, tourism, and port operations stopped. Families searched camps and hospitals for relatives. Governments prioritized potable water, sanitation, and disease control alongside body recovery and identification. Afterwards, countries launched the Indian Ocean Tsunami Warning and Mitigation System, adding deep ocean sensors and tide gauges, standardizing alert systems, deploying coastal sirens, and instituting evacuation drills. On April 20th, 1999, in Littleton, Colorado, two seniors, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, planned a mass attack at Columbine High School. They placed two large propane bombs in the cafeteria timed for lunch. At 11:17 a.m., the devices failed to detonate. At 11:19 a.m., they began shooting outside the west entrance and then entered the school. Students and staff evacuated or sheltered in classrooms. School Resource Officer Deputy Neil Gardner exchanged gunfire with Harris near the west doors, though neither was hit. Additional officers arrived, set up perimeters, and started clearing rooms while reports of explosives slowed their movement. The attackers moved through hallways to the library. This is where most fatalities occurred. They briefly left the library, returned, and took their own lives. Before the attack, Harris saw classmate Brooks Brown in the parking lot. Harris and Brooks had recently reconciled after earlier having a disagreement. He told Brooks, "I like you now. Go home." In a library, John Savage asked Klebold if he could leave. Klebold told him to go, and he exited. Investigators later found journals and videos showing the attackers intended a mass casualty bombing and sought notoriety. When the cafeteria devices failed, they carried out the shooting instead. The assault lasted about 50 minutes. By 12:08 p.m., gunfire ended. 13 people were killed, 12 students and 1 teacher. 21 others were wounded by gunfire. Additional injuries occurred during escape and evacuation. Bomb squads located and rendered safe multiple devices, including the cafeteria bombs and car bombs set to detonate later. The campus remained a crime scene for days. Investigators documented the timeline, weapons, and explosives, and collected hundreds of witness statements. Columbine reshaped police protocols toward rapid entry active shooter response and pushed schools into lockdown drills, threat assessment, and campus security upgrades. It also ignited national debates on guns and media. Congress held hearings that passed no sweeping federal law directly tied to the attack, while Colorado voters in 2000 approved background checks for gun show sales. In late August 2005, Tropical Storm Katrina intensified over the Gulf of Mexico, becoming a hurricane, and tracked towards the northern Gulf Coast. Mandatory and voluntary evacuations were issued. While most residents left, many lacked transportation, money, or time to do so. The storm made landfall with severe wind and rain across multiple states. Around New Orleans, the largest impacts were felt when levees and floodwalls failed at multiple canals and basins. Low-lying neighborhoods filled quickly. People moved into attics and onto roofs. Helicopters, boats, and high-water vehicles conducted rescue. The Louisiana Superdome and the Ernest N. Morial Convention Center took in thousands. Supplies were limited, sanitation deteriorated, and medical needs rose. Across the Gulf Coast, more than 1,800 people died. Hundreds of thousands were displaced. Search and rescue teams went door to door by boat and truck, recording entries, hazards, and outcomes on exterior walls. Hospitals were forced to run on generators. They evacuated patients when possible and coordinated with arriving military and federal personnel. Communications were unreliable and fuel shortages slowed logistics. Law enforcement and National Guard units secured critical sites and helped with the distribution of water and food. Katrina exposed major gaps in planning, communication, and logistics regarding hurricane preparedness and response, from evacuation and sheltering to supply delivery and interagency coordination. Afterward, Congress passed the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act. Planning was strengthened, and New Orleans rebuilt and elevated its levees, gates, and pumps. January 28, 1986. Kennedy Space Center, Florida. The Shuttle Challenger launched with a crew of 7, including Krista McAuliffe. McAuliffe was a teacher from Concord High School in New Hampshire. She was selected through NASA's Teacher in Space project to teach lessons from orbit. Because of this, the launch was broadcast live in classrooms all across America. At 11:38 a.m., the shuttle lifted off. 73 seconds into its flight, the shuttle broke apart. Unfortunately, all 7 crew members were lost. Rescue and recovery efforts deployed from the Cape and nearby Coast Guard assets. NASA grounded the shuttle fleet. President Ronald Reagan named former Secretary of State William P. Rogers to lead the investigation, later known as the Rogers Commission. The shuttle was originally supposed to launch on January 22nd, but was delayed until January 28th for various reasons. The weather that morning was unusually cold for Florida. Video evidence and debris was collected. The board discovered that O-ring seals did not perform as expected due to the cold weather. This allowed hot gases to burn through and compromise the vehicle's structure and led to catastrophic failure. Engineers from the contractor who built the boosters containing the failed O-ring raised concerns about low temperature in pre-launch discussions. However, the launch went ahead as planned. NASA paused shuttle flights for nearly 3 years following the Challenger disaster, returning to flight in 1988 with new hardware and pre-launch procedures in place. A 7.0 magnitude earthquake struck near Port-au-Prince, Haiti on January 12, 2010 at 4:53 p.m. local time. Haiti is very poor, and a lot of housing was built by owners, not engineers. Codes weren't widely enforced, so rebar was left out or installed wrong, and walls and columns couldn't handle the shaking. Hotels, schools, apartments, and government offices suffered major collapse. Even the National Palace was heavily damaged. Residents began rescue with hand tools, car jacks, and improvised stretchers. Streets were blocked by debris and downed power lines. Hospitals were quickly filled to capacity. Open areas became triage points. The main port was damaged, slowing shipborne aid. Air traffic control managed a surge of relief flights on limited ramp space. International urban search and rescue teams arrived within days with search dogs, listening gear, and medical supplies. Field clinics, water distribution sites, and temporary shelters went up in parks and stadiums. Body recovery and identification proceeded right alongside treatment of crush injuries and infections. Aftershocks complicated rescue operations. Names of the missing were posted at medical clinics and broadcast over radio. Aid groups and local trucks moved water, food, and fuel by any passable route. Police and soldiers guarded warehouses and escorted convoys. Engineers tagged buildings red, yellow, or green to guide the returns. Road clearing opened paths to hospitals and supply points. The airport ran day and night for relief traffic. Millions were displaced, and fatalities exceeded 200,000. On April 26, 1986, at 1:23 a.m., the most catastrophic nuclear accident in history occurred in Chernobyl, Ukraine. A safety test at Reactor 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear plant was taking place when a power surge caused 2 explosions that destroyed part of the reactor building. The explosions blew the 1,000-ton upper shield aside and opened the core to the air. Burning fuel and graphite were thrown on the turbine hall roof and surrounding area, causing fires to break out. Radiation near the reactor was high enough to kill unprotected workers within minutes to hours. Plant workers and local firefighters responded without full awareness of radiation levels. In nearby Pripyat, routine morning activities continued while radiation readings rose. Authorities organized buses and ordered evacuation later that day and the next. Residents left with just the essentials, expecting a temporary move. Elevated radiation detected in other countries triggered international alarm and broader public disclosure. Radioactive isotopes were carried more than 1,000 kilometers, or 620 miles, away. Soviet emergency forces deployed hundreds of thousands of personnel, known as liquidators. They extinguished fires, scraped contaminated soil, washed buildings, and built a concrete sarcophagus around the destroyed reactor. A 30-kilometer exclusion zone was established. Within days, it was discovered that molten fuel was melting through the concrete reactor floor, making its way slowly down towards the suppression pools below. If the lava-like substance touched the water, it would cause a radiation-contaminated steam explosion that could destroy the entire plant along with its 3 reactors, causing unimaginable damage and nuclear fallout the world would struggle to recover from. The pools, containing some 20 million liters of water, had to be drained, and the only way to do that was by manually turning the correct valves down in the now flooded basement. On January 6, 1986, 2 plant engineers and a shift supervisor went into the flooded corridors beneath Unit 4 to open valves on suppression pools. Using flashlights, they waded through radioactive water to locate the valves and drain the pools. They were successful in their mission and helped avert a secondary blast and even wider release of radiation. On March 11, 2011, at 2:46 p.m. local time, a 9.0 earthquake struck off Japan's northeast coast. Minutes of strong shaking hit cities and ports. About 45 minutes later, a tsunami breached seawalls along the coast. At the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power station, the 6-reactor plant on Japan's northeast coast, floodwater swamped basements, switchgear, and diesel generators. The site lost most power needed for cooling. Reactors 1 through 3 shut down automatically, but decay heat remained. The cores still needed steady cooling. Batteries ran for hours, then died. Pumps stopped. Temperatures and pressures rose inside the vessels. Operators opened vent valves to route steam from the reactor and containment into the suppression pool, and when needed, out the tall exhaust stack, lowering pressure but releasing some radioactive gas. They began water injection with fire engines and later seawater to keep fuel covered. Over the next 3 days, hydrogen explosions damaged multiple buildings. On March 12th, a blast blew off Unit 1's upper walls. On March 14th, Unit 3 exploded. Early on March 15th, a hydrogen event damaged the Unit 4 building, and Unit 2 suffered suppression pool damage. Debris blanketed the yards, and radiation levels spiked in bursts, then fell. More than 150,000 residents were evacuated from towns around the plant. The earthquake and tsunami left nearly 20,000 dead or missing along the coast. After the first week, the plant was stable, but long-term cleanup and dismantling will take decades. On April 14, 1912, at 11:40 p.m., the RMS Titanic struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic. The impact tore open several forward compartments along the starboard side. Water rose quickly. Watertight bulkheads were not high enough to stop the flow. On the bridge were Captain Edward J. Smith, First Officer William Murdoch, and Fourth Officer Joseph Boxhall. They assessed damage and ordered the engines stopped. Distress calls were sent out. Nearby ships received the distress signals. Tragically, the nearest ship at the time of the accident, the SS Californian, never got the distress call. The crew member in charge of the wireless systems that would have received the call had gone to bed and shut the system off. The Californian was approximately 10 miles away. The RMS Carpathia, 60 miles away, turned toward the Titanic at full speed, and its crew began to uncover and swing out the lifeboats. Loading of the lifeboats on the sinking ship started around 12:40 a.m. Officers used women and children first. Due to passenger confusion and poor crew training, many boats left partly filled. The ship kept power and lights for much of the evacuation, making some passengers reluctant to leave a brightly lit ocean liner for a small lifeboat in the cold, dark Atlantic Ocean. By 2 a.m., the Titanic's bow was almost level with the water. At the same time, the stern rose higher out of the water. At 2:20 a.m., Titanic disappeared. The RMS Carpathia reached the scene around 4 a.m. and took survivors aboard. Other ships arrived later to search the area. More than 1,500 people died from exposure and drowning. About 700 survived in boats and rafts.